This video opens with Ren standing in her bright, renovated kitchen, sunlight streaming through vintage windows. She's holding her morning coffee, looking genuinely happy and proud. The contrast between this peaceful moment and her opening statement creates immediate tension. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. My name is Ren Patterson, and 6 months ago, I was living in a cramped studio apartment above a Thai restaurant in downtown Columbus, Ohio. At 32, I was a freelance graphic designer making enough to pay rent and buy decent coffee, but home ownership felt like a fantasy. That all changed when my grandmother Cordelia passed away last spring. She was the kind of woman who collected vintage teacups and always smelled like lavender and old books. We had this special bond that my parents never quite understood. While my mom and dad got small keepsakes from her estate, I inherited something that changed my entire life. $58,000 and a handwritten note that said, "Use this to build the life you deserve, sweetheart." I spent 3 months house hunting before I found this place on Maple Street. It's a 1940s colonial with original hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and the most beautiful crown molding I'd ever seen. The moment I walked through the front door, I felt something I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just a house, it was home. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, had maintained it beautifully. They were moving to Florida and seemed almost relieved that someone young was taking over. Mrs. Henderson actually teared up when she handed me the keys and said, "This house needs laughter again." My younger brother Damon was the first person I called after signing the papers. He's 28, works construction, and has these massive hands that make him perfect for moving furniture and fixing things I'm too scared to touch. The day I got the keys, he showed up with his truck, a toolbox, and enough enthusiasm to power the entire neighborhood. My parents, Helen and Gregory Patterson, were supportive, but I could sense something underneath their congratulations. Maybe it was jealousy that Grandma Cordelia had chosen me for this gift. Or maybe they thought I was rushing into something too big for me to handle alone. For the first 2 weeks in the house, everything felt magical. I was documenting my renovation projects on Instagram, showing off the way morning light hit the stained glass window in the stairway, and how perfectly my furniture fit in the living room like it had always belonged there. My best friend Isla would come by every morning with coffee from the local shop, and we'd sit on the front porch planning which room to tackle next. I felt proud, independent, and grateful in a way I'd never experienced before. But there was one thing that nagged at me from the very beginning. The basement felt wrong somehow. Not scary wrong, just off. When I measured the upstairs rooms and compared them to the basement layout, something didn't add up. The basement felt smaller than it should have been, like there was missing space somewhere. I mentioned it to Damon once, and he just shrugged and said old houses are weird like that. But every time I went downstairs to do laundry or grab something from storage, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was keeping a secret from me. Standing in that kitchen now, 6 weeks after moving in, I had no idea that my perfect life was about to be turned completely upside down. I had no idea that my beloved grandmother Cordelia had left me much more than money and a house. She had left me a mystery that would reveal a truth so devastating it would change how I saw everything. I thought I knew about my family and myself. Growing up, I was always the one my family turned to when things went wrong. When my dad lost his job during the recession, I was the one who helped him update his resume. When my mom went through her health scare 3 years ago, I was the one organizing doctor appointments and staying overnight at the hospital. Damon used to joke that I was born 30 years old, but it never bothered me. Taking care of people felt natural. Maybe because Grandma Cordelia had taken such good care of me. Every Sunday after church, while my parents socialized with their friends, I would slip away to sit with Grandma Cordelia on the church steps. She would tell me stories about her childhood, though looking back now, those stories were always vague and somehow sad. She would say things like, "Promise me something, Ren. Promise me you'll always have a safe place to call home." At the time, I thought she was just being sentimental. Now I wonder if she knew something I didn't. When Cordelia's lawyer called me into his office 6 months ago, I expected to receive maybe a piece of jewelry or one of her vintage teacups. Instead, he handed me a cashier's check for $58,000 and that handwritten note. The paper smelled like her lavender perfume, and her careful cursive handwriting made my chest tight with grief and gratitude. What struck me most was how specific the amount was. Not $60,000 or $50,000, but exactly $58,000. Like she had calculated precisely what my parents' reaction to the inheritance was complicated. Mom kept saying how wonderful it was that I could finally buy a house, but I caught her whispering to Dad about how Cordelia had always played favorites. Dad was more direct during one family dinner when he said, "I hope this money doesn't change. You, sweetheart. Your grandmother could be generous, but she could also be secretive." I didn't understand what he meant by secretive, but something in his tone made me uncomfortable. 3 weeks into home ownership, I had settled into a routine that felt like the adult life I'd always wanted. Every morning, I would make coffee in my sunny kitchen and plan out my day. Weekdays were for freelance work in the spare bedroom I'd converted to an office. Weekends were for renovation projects, usually with Damon's help. He would show up Saturday mornings with donuts and whatever tools we needed, and we'd spend the day painting walls or refinishing furniture. Isla Chen had been my best friend since we met in college graphic design classes, and she was living vicariously through my home renovation journey. She would arrive most afternoons with iced lattes and her laptop, working on her own projects while keeping me company. Isla had this way of making everything feel like an adventure. When I worried about taking on such a big mortgage, she would remind me that Grandma Cordelia wouldn't have left me the money if she didn't believe I could handle it. The house itself seemed to welcome me. The hardwood floors creaked in familiar patterns. The kitchen window faced east, filling the space with golden light every morning. The built-in bookshelves in the living room fit my book collection perfectly, like they had been waiting for me. Even the quirky things felt charming, like how the bathroom door stuck when it rained, or how the stairs had one step that was slightly higher than the others. But that nagging feeling about the basement kept growing stronger. I had measured every room upstairs and compared it to the basement layout. There should have been at least 8 more feet of space somewhere. The math didn't work. When I mentioned this to Mrs. Henderson before she moved to Florida, she got this strange look on her face and said, "Some houses hold their secrets close, dear. Not all of them need to be discovered." Her words stuck with me in a way that felt almost like a warning. My days had fallen into a comfortable pattern. Morning coffee, client work, afternoon breaks with Isla, evening phone calls with my family. But every time I went to the basement to switch laundry or grab something from storage, I found myself staring at that back wall behind the furnace. The wood paneling looked newer than the rest of the basement, and sometimes I could swear I felt a draft coming from behind it. It was during one of these laundry trips that I finally decided to take a closer look. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed back downstairs, telling myself I was probably imagining things. But as I knelt down and ran my hand along the bottom of that wall panel, my fingers found something that made my heart race. There was definitely a gap, and when I pressed against the wood, it moved slightly, like it wasn't attached to anything solid behind it. That gap behind the wood panel consumed my thoughts for the next 3 days. Every time I tried to focus on work or enjoy my morning coffee, my mind would drift back to that loose piece of paneling. On Thursday morning, I finally gave in and went back downstairs with my flashlight and a measuring tape. What I found made my hands shake. The panel was definitely not attached to the wall behind it, and when I measured the space, I confirmed what I had suspected all along. There was an entire section of the basement that simply didn't exist on my side of that wall. I started noticing details I had missed before. The ceiling beams above that section were different from the rest of the basement, newer and painted a slightly different shade of white. The electrical conduit that ran along the basement ceiling took an odd detour around that area, like it had been rerouted to avoid something. Most disturbing of all, when I got down on my hands and knees with the flashlight, I could see scratches in the wood paneling. Deep scratches that looked deliberate, almost frantic, like someone had clawed at the wood from this side. When Damon came over that Saturday to help me install new light fixtures in the kitchen, I couldn't keep quiet about my discovery anymore. "There's something weird about the basement wall behind the furnace," I told him as we sat eating lunch. His reaction was immediate and strange. He stopped chewing his sandwich and got this look on his face that I had never seen before, almost panicked. "Ren, seriously, don't go looking for problems in this house. You just got here. Some old houses have weird layouts, that's all." But Damon had helped renovate dozens of houses through his construction work. He knew the difference between weird layouts and missing space. Isla had the opposite reaction when I showed her the basement the next day. She ran her hands along the panel and immediately understood what I was seeing. "Girl, this is definitely not normal. Look at how this wood doesn't match anything else down here." She pointed out that the rest of the basement had painted concrete walls, but this section was covered in wood paneling that looked like it had been added later. "If there's a hidden room behind here, you have to find out what's in it. What if the previous owners left something valuable? What if it's full of vintage furniture or old artwork?" That Sunday at family dinner, I decided to bring up my discovery to see how my parents would react. The moment I mentioned the basement wall, the entire mood at the table shifted. Dad put down his fork and gave me this stern look that reminded me of being in trouble as a child. "Ren, honey, some things are better left alone. You have a beautiful house now. Focus on making it your own instead of obsessing over every little quirk." Mom jumped in quickly, almost too quickly. "Your father's right, sweetheart. Old houses always have oddities. Why don't you tell us about your new clients instead?" But I caught something in that moment that made my stomach drop. My parents exchanged a look across the table, and it wasn't casual concern. It was fear. Mom's eyes were wide, and Dad gave her the slightest shake of his head. They knew something about this house, or about houses in general, that they weren't telling me. When I pressed them about it, Dad got unusually firm. "Promise me you won't go digging around in areas that were clearly sealed off for a reason. Some renovations are done for safety, some for privacy. Either way, it's not your business." That night, I couldn't sleep. I spent hours researching the history of my house online, looking through old city records and newspaper archives. The house had been built in 1947 by a family named the Caldwells. They lived there for 8 years before selling it suddenly in 1955. After that, it changed hands 3 times in quick succession before the Hendersons bought it in 1962 and lived there for 60 years. That pattern of quick sales in the 1950s felt significant, but I couldn't find any details about why the families kept leaving. By the following Wednesday, the mystery had taken over my life. I was distracted during client calls, couldn't concentrate on design work, and found myself standing in that basement multiple times a day, staring at the wall. The scratches in the wood seemed deeper every time I looked at them. The gap at the bottom of the panel seemed wider. I started having dreams about voices coming from behind that wall, though I knew that was impossible. That's when I realized I couldn't live with not knowing. Whatever was behind that wall, whatever my family was afraid I might find, I needed to see it for myself. This was my house now, my responsibility. If there was something dangerous or important hidden back there, ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. Friday morning, I called in sick to work and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to open that wall, regardless of what anyone else wanted me to do. I woke up that Friday morning with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. The obsession with that wall had been eating at me, affecting my sleep, my work, and my relationships. I couldn't continue living in a house where I felt like I was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. After my morning coffee, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list of everything I would need. A crowbar, a hammer, work gloves, multiple flashlights, my phone charger, and a first aid kit just in case I encountered something sharp or dangerous behind that wall. I wasn't going to be reckless about this. If my family's reactions had taught me anything, it was that whatever lay behind that panel might be significant or even dangerous. I sent a detailed text message to Isla explaining exactly what I was planning to do and where I would be in the house. "If you don't hear from me by 6 tonight, call the police and tell them to check the basement," I wrote. It felt dramatic, but something about my father's warning and my brother's panicked reaction made me want to be cautious. Standing in my basement that morning, Tools spread out on the concrete floor. I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't just about satisfying curiosity anymore. This felt like crossing a line that my entire family had warned me not to cross. Part of me wondered if I should call Damon and ask him to be there with me, but his reaction the previous week had been so strange that I wasn't sure I could trust him to be supportive. Whatever I found behind that wall, I needed to see it with my own eyes first. The wood panel was more stubborn than I had expected. I started by trying to pry it loose with my hands, but it was attached more securely than it appeared. The crowbar was necessary, and every loud crack and groan of the wood made me freeze, listening for sounds from upstairs, even though I knew I was alone in the house. After 20 minutes of careful prying, the entire panel finally came loose with a sound like a gunshot that echoed through the basement. Behind the panel was something I hadn't expected. Not just empty space or storage, but an actual door. It was painted the same gray-green color as the basement walls, camouflaged so perfectly that it would have been invisible if you weren't looking for it. The door was old, probably original to the house, with an old-fashioned round doorknob that had been painted over multiple times. What made my heart race was the hardware I could see on my side of the door. There were 3 separate slide bolts, all positioned to lock the door from the outside. Standing in front of that door, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool basement air. Doors with 3 locks on the outside aren't meant to keep people out. They're meant to keep someone in. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Promise me you'll always have a safe place to call home. Had she known about this door? Had she known what it meant? My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob, and I had to take several deep breaths before I could work up the courage to turn it. Every instinct I had was telling me to step back, to replace the panel, to pretend I had never found this door. My family's warning suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't about old house quirks or harmless secrets. This was about something that had been deliberately hidden, something that required 3 separate locks to contain. But I had come too far to turn back now. I thought about Grandma Cordelia and the specific amount of money she had left me. $58,000. Exactly enough to buy this house. Had she wanted me to find this door? Before opening the door, I made sure my phone was recording everything. I wanted documentation of whatever I was about to discover, both for my own protection and because I had a feeling that what lay beyond this door would need to be shared with authorities. I checked that my flashlight was working properly, made sure the basement door upstairs was propped open for quick escape if necessary, and took one last look at the text I had sent to Isla to make sure she knew where to find me. With my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, I slowly turned the doorknob. The mechanism was stiff from years of disuse, but it turned. I heard the latch release with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire house. Whatever lay beyond this door had been waiting in darkness for decades, and I was about to be the first person to see it in all that time. I pushed the door open and stepped into the unknown. The beam of my flashlight revealed a space that made my legs go weak. I was looking into a small, windowless room that felt frozen in time. The walls were painted a pale yellow that had faded and peeled over the decades, and covering every inch of those walls were drawings. Hundreds of drawings in crayon and pencil, created by the hands of a child. Stick figures, houses with crooked chimneys, flowers with too many petals, and words written in careful block letters. But these weren't happy childhood artwork. These were the desperate creations of someone who had nothing else to do but draw on walls. As I stepped fully into the room, the reality of what I was seeing hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a playroom or storage space. In the corner sat a small metal bed frame with a thin, stained mattress. Chains were bolted directly into the concrete wall above the bed, with metal cuffs still attached. A plastic bucket sat in the opposite corner, and the smell that hit me when I moved closer made me gag and step back. This room had been someone's prison, and they had been kept here for a very long time. Scattered around the room were items that told a heartbreaking story. A few books with pages torn out, probably used for drawing paper when the walls got too crowded. A small wooden toy horse with most of the paint worn off from being handled over and over. A tattered blanket that might have once been blue but was now gray with age and dirt. These weren't random objects. They were the treasured possessions of a child who had very little else to hold on to. Near the bed, partially hidden under the old mattress, I found a small composition notebook with a marbled black and white cover. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. But when I saw the name written on the first page in careful cursive, my world tilted completely off its axis. Property of Cordelia May Whitmore. Whitmore had been my grandmother's maiden name. This was her handwriting, but the dates at the top of each entry were from 1953 and 1954, when she would have been only 8 and 9 years old. The diary entries were written in the voice of a frightened child, but they told a story that explained everything I had never understood about my grandmother. The mean people brought me here 3 days ago. They say I have to be quiet or they will hurt Mama and Papa. I drew pictures on the wall today because I miss my room at home. I hope someone finds me soon. Entry after entry described days and weeks and months of captivity. The people who had taken her fed her enough to keep her alive, but nothing more. They told her that her parents had stopped looking for her, that everyone had forgotten about her. The final entries in the diary were different, written in handwriting that was slightly more mature, as if she had grown up during her captivity. I found a way to move one of the loose stones near the floor. I have been working on it every night when they sleep. Tonight I am going to try to get out. If something happens to me, I want someone to know that I was here and I was brave. 3. Last entry was dated almost 2 years after the first one. I got out. I ran all the way home, but Mama and Papa moved away. A nice lady at the church helped me find them. I told them I fell and hit my head and couldn't remember where I had been. I will never tell anyone about this room. Standing in that room, reading my grandmother's words as a terrified child, I finally understood everything. The specific inheritance amount, the insistence that I have a safe place to call home, even her sometimes strange behavior when I was growing up. Cordelia had bought this house decades later, not as a home, but as a guardian. She had made sure that this room would never be used to hurt another child. She had spent her adult life protecting others from the hell she had endured as a little girl. Tucked between the last pages of the diary was a folded piece of paper that wasn't old like the rest. The handwriting was my grandmother's, but as an adult. Wren, if you are reading this, it means you found what I could never bear to show anyone. I bought this house in 1978 and sealed this room, but I could never bring myself to destroy it. This is my burden, but it doesn't have to be yours. The people who did this to me are long dead, but the room remains as proof that I survived. Do with this knowledge what your heart tells you is right. All my love, Grandma Cordelia. I sat in that room for almost an hour, reading and rereading my grandmother's diary entries, before I could bring myself to leave. When I finally climbed the basement stairs, my legs were shaking so badly I had to hold on to the railing. The first call I made was to the police. Detective Maria Santos arrived within 20 minutes. And when I showed her the room in the diary, I watched this experienced officer's face go completely pale. She called in a team of specialists who spent the next 6 hours documenting everything, photographing the drawings on the walls, collecting evidence, and treating that terrible little room like the crime scene it had been. That evening, I called an emergency family meeting. When my parents and Damon arrived at my house, I could see in their faces that they already knew something had changed. I led them to the basement and showed them the open doorway. My mother broke down crying immediately, and my father sank onto my basement steps with his head in his hands. We suspected, he whispered, when your grandmother bought this house so suddenly, when she would never let anyone go in the basement, when she would get that haunted look whenever anyone mentioned her childhood. We suspected, but we were too cowardly to ask. Through tears, my mother explained that Cordelia had disappeared for almost 2 years when she was 8 years old. The official story was that she had been found wandering in a neighboring town with amnesia, unable to remember where she had been. The family never questioned it because they were so grateful to have her back. She never talked about those missing years, Mom said, and we learned not to ask because it would send her into these dark moods that could last for weeks. My father admitted they had noticed Cordelia's obsession with safety, her need to know where everyone was at all times, her insistence that I always tell someone where I was going. Detective Santos contacted the FBI, and within days, my grandmother's diary had reopened a case that had been cold for 70 years. The house records showed that in 1953 and 1954, it had been owned by Robert and Margaret Caldwell, both of whom had died in the 1980s. But the investigation revealed that they had been suspected in the disappearances of 3 other children during that same time period. My grandmother's diary provided the first concrete evidence of what had happened to those missing children, and it gave closure to families who had spent decades wondering what had become of their loved ones. The story became national news within a week. "Grandmother's secret leads to solving 70-year-old cold case" was the headline that appeared on major news outlets across the country. But what surprised me most was how many people reached out to share similar stories. Adults who had experienced childhood trauma and spent their lives protecting others from the same fate. Survivors who had never found the courage to speak about their experiences until they saw my grandmother's story. I decided to keep the house, but I couldn't leave that room as it was. Working with a trauma-informed therapist and a child advocacy organization, I transformed the space into something that honored both my grandmother's survival and the other children who might not have been as fortunate. I had the walls professionally preserved, but I installed soft lighting and added a small garden area with a window that looks out onto a memorial space in my backyard. The room became a place of remembrance rather than captivity. Using the remainder of my inheritance and donations that poured in after the story broke, I established the Cordelia Foundation, focused on supporting missing children investigations and helping adult survivors of childhood abduction. We work with law enforcement to keep cold cases active and provide resources for families who are still searching for answers. Every month we host support groups in my living room for survivors who are ready to share their stories. Living in this house has taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting or pretending trauma never happened. It means transforming pain into purpose. My grandmother spent 45 years carrying this secret alone, but she turned her silence into protection for others. She bought this house not as a home for herself, but as a prison for her demons. Now it's become a place where other people can find the courage to speak their truths. Every night when I lock my doors, I think about my grandmother's final diary entry and her promise that this room would never hurt another child. She kept that promise, and now it's my responsibility to continue her work. The most profound inheritances aren't always money or property. Sometimes they're the courage to break cycles of silence and transform our deepest wounds into our greatest sources of strength.